Hello, this is Adam Horton, and we are back for part 2 of Dominion 201. The focus of Dominion 201 is to learn how to assess a kingdom using a methodical approach that I particularly like. And in this episode, I want to focus on the aspects of that methodical approach that center around looking for engines and assessing engines. So, the first thing I look for when I look at a kingdom are the presence of attack cards and defense cards. So, in this particular kingdom, for example, there's the presence of both Militia and Witch. So Militia is a discard attack and Witch is a junking attack or a cursing attack. So, usually the safe thing to assume is that any powerful attack is going to be played a lot against you by a competent opponent. So the presence of the discard and the junking attack means that you need to assume that you're going to get curses in your deck. You need to assume that you're going to start a good amount of hands with only 3 cards in your hand. Particularly in multiplayer, there are trashing attacks that can be pretty rough, but they aren't always as devastating as the discard and the junking attacks are. So, how do you deal with the attacks? Well, there's always the option of attacking back. If they're going to attack you, you'll always be able to attack them, and usually that should be a component of your strategy regardless. If the attack is worth playing, you want to make sure you're doing it if your opponent's also doing it. That'll at least help to level the playing field. But that's not the only option. There are lots of different kinds of defense. There's active defense, like Moat. Moat is active defense to any attack. You have it in your hand and the attack doesn't hurt you. Other cards, like Watchtower, for example, this is active defense for cursing attacks because the Watchtower will let you trash incoming curses. It also is a draw up to card, so it can work as sort of a light counter to discard attacks, provided you're happy with either drawing up to 6 cards in hand and having no action left, or you have a plan for keeping a village in your hand as well. So defense usually plays an important role. You can also work to counter attacks, like discard attacks. Remember, they have their counters in cards like Watchtower and Library that will allow you to draw up, and they give you a sifting advantage as well. There are cards like Tunnel that counter discard attacks. And then for the Junkers, there are cards like Ambassador and Masquerade, which are pretty active counters for cursing attacks. And these are the kind of things that, if they're present in the kingdom, you want to think twice about going for that kind of attack. So the fact that Watchtower is in the kingdom will make me think twice about getting a Militia. But there's no active counter to a cursing attack, so Witch is going to be pretty important this game. Of course, the other way to defend against cursing attacks is to trash the curses after they're already in your deck. But I want to stress that this is not nearly as good as the other types of defense if you can pull them off. It's better to remove a curse before it gets in your deck, because then you never have to draw it. It's also difficult when you're not on top of trashing and keeping a very thin deck to keep on top of the curses. Draw cards really help to match up your trasher with the cards that you actually want to trash. And speaking of deck size, running a thin deck is usually a good idea, and it's actually a pretty strong counter, pseudo-counter to most attacks, with the exception of trashing attacks, which are otherwise weak. The other option you have when there are attacks present are ignoring the attacks. I want to point out this is the exception and not the rule. Usually this is the case with very weak attacks, where you can just sort of blow past them, and the opportunity cost of getting the attack may be more than the damage the attack actually does. These are the exception. They usually only happen with weak attacks, like deck inspection attacks. Spy, for example. It's a very light attack, so you're usually trying to get other benefits from those cards if you're actually buying them. So whatever plan you have for attacking your opponent and dealing with the fact that you will be attacked by your opponent, that's a part of the deck you're going to make. And you have to keep that in the back of your head when you're doing the rest of your assessment. So, what's the second thing I'm looking for when I'm assessing a kingdom? Well, the presence of trashing is the next thing I look for. So let's take a look at the trashing cards on this kingdom. The 2 trashers we've got are Upgrade and Steward. Steward is strong trashing because it allows you to remove 2 cards, 2 bad cards from your deck in one play. Upgrade is a pretty good card. It's technically weak trashing, but it's got the cantrip part, so it's still pretty strong, and it's easy to get a lot of them in your deck and not lose too much tempo. With the presence of trashing, you can usually have a lot more control over the size of your deck, particularly when there are cursors out. So whenever there's a cursing attack, you want to think, how can I deal with the curses once they're in my deck? Trashing really helps that, but it also allows you to have a thin deck. So this is something important to consider. If something you want to do requires a thin deck and there's no way to get it, well, then you probably don't want to go for that because it ain't going to work. So what size do you want your deck to be? Well, usually smaller is better. That's not always the case. But if you can run a thin deck, chances are you're going to want to go for that. Now, when you're running a thin deck, you have to keep a couple things in mind, remember. You have to have a plan to get the green cards. If your deck isn't going to work when it has provinces in it, well, it's not going to work because it didn't work with the coppers and estates in it. The provinces are just as dead. The other thing to consider is that there are some alternative victory cards, like, remember, Gardens or Duke, that will promote having a big deck because they need to handle more green cards in the deck, but their price point is lower. You only need to hit $5 or $4 to get those cards. So when you're playing for alternate VP, a big deck might not be so bad. So we've located the trashers on this board. Trashing doesn't always have to be in the context of an engine. Remember, trashing in a big money context can be useful as well. You start the game with 3 dead cards in your deck, so if you can trash out your estates, you're going to get a tempo advantage that's going to be well worth the 3 points you sacrifice for getting rid of those estates. If you're going to play a money deck, the copper trashing usually isn't worth the tempo loss. You have to take time to trash the coppers, and then your deck will stall faster once you've gotten there. So if you're going to play a money-based deck, estate trashing is good, copper trashing isn't. If you're going to play an engine, you probably want to get rid of all of these starting cards. The biggest exception to the rule about copper trashing in a money deck, though, is when there's a colony game. The colony games are probably going to be longer, and coppers are so much worse because you have to hit $11 in 5 cards, that getting rid of the coppers then is usually a good idea. So, trashing in general. Let's say there's no junking attacks. You've got 10 cards in between you and what you want to do. How many can you get rid of? If you can get rid of 7 of them, but there's no way to get rid of the estates, well, you're doing pretty good. If you can only get rid of the estates, you've still got 7 cards in between you and what you want to do. So keep that in mind. With junkers around, it could be even worse. If you can't get rid of curses, or if you're not going to be able to get rid of them as fast as they're coming into your deck, you're never going to have that super trim deck you want. Or if you do get there, it might be too late and your opponent might have already gotten a huge victory point lead. So, the other thing to consider is, more than just whether or not you can get rid of them, is how fast. Remember the distinction between strong trashing and weak trashing. Steward is a card you can open with because it only costs 3, and it gets rid of 2 bad cards at once. So this is a great accelerator to an engine deck. Early trashing usually benefits you a lot more. Upgrade costs 5, so chances are you won't be opening with it, and it only gets rid of 1 card at a time. It's great, but you have to consider you might not be getting rid of these cards as fast as you otherwise would. When there's only weak trashing available, well, you can supplement the weak trashing. In the case of upgrade, you can just buy more upgrades. It's non-terminal, so you don't have to worry about them colliding. Another thing you might want to consider is the presence of sifting. Cards like Cellar and Warehouse that don't get the cards out of your deck, but make it a lot easier for your deck to function while the cards are in your deck. Other sifters include Cartographer or Apothecary and Crossroads. Crossroads makes use of the green that you've got now and the green that you'll hopefully buy at some point, and Apothecary makes it almost like these coppers aren't even in your deck. So there are alternatives to trashing even if you can't get rid of the cards that can make your deck function just as well as if it didn't have the cards in it at all. Another alternative to trashing is huge draw. If I've created a massive draw engine that can draw tons of cards, draw my entire deck, well, maybe it can draw these 10 cards, and that's just fine. Another alternative to trashing is pseudo-trashing, or cards that don't actually remove bad cards from your deck, but they serve the same purpose. Cards like Native Village or Island come to mind when I think of pseudo-trashing. How important is the trashing? Sometimes your deck can function okay with all the cards in it, and okay quicker without taking time to trash may be better than really good but too late. So these are all things to consider when you're deciding how big of a deck you want to build. So, the options that you decided for attacking and managing attacks, and now the options you've decided for your deck size and how you're going to get there, those are all a part of your plan. So whatever plan you want, make sure you know what's available and make sure you keep that in mind as you're considering what's on the board. The next thing I like to do on a Dominion board is look for combos. Now, these are usually 2 to 3 card combos that you build your entire deck around. Now there's a list of combos that's there, and usually when those combos are there, you kind of ignore everything else, you just make sure that nothing else breaks it. Now, unfortunately, these combos won't just jump out at you until you're familiar with all of them. So you may consider reading over the articles and playing a few games with those combo decks just to know what it feels like and get a gauge for how powerful they really are. But it's usually at this point that I've considered what the game landscape is going to be and if a combo deck is really going to work. It'll usually jump out to me at this point. And now the fourth thing that I look for. I like to think of it as knowing your limitations. I like to assess the presence of a couple of other factors on the board that are usually vital for building an engine. The first one of them is the presence of draw. If there's no way to increase your hand size, it's going to be very difficult to build an engine that can do lots of cool stuff. Decks with no draw tend to have some limitations, particularly when they start greening. They stall pretty quickly, and you need a plan to deal with that. Examples of plans are pseudo-trashing, to put aside your green cards so your deck can still function, VP tokens as your main source of points, or you can just get all of your points in one mega turn, buy 5 provinces at once, and then you never have to play with the deck that's got green cards in it and potentially could be broken. On this particular board, there are several options, though. Smithy gives you +3 cards, the Steward has an option for 2 cards, the Witch gives you 2 cards. So there seem to be ways to increase hand size on this board. But if that's not available, well, you better have a plan for it, or else not go for the engine. Another thing you might want to look for is the presence of a village. There are 2 villages on this board, Workers' Village and Bandit Camp. So, you should be okay playing multiple terminal actions in a turn. But without a village, you're never going to be able to play more than 1 terminal action in a turn. So if that's not okay with you, if that's not enough, well, then your strategy is going to have an issue. Similarly with plus buy. If I can only buy 1 card a turn, if no card gives me a plus buy, well, I'm going to have a problem. It's going to be difficult for me to catch up to a money player, because usually an engine player is going to have to buy multiple victory cards at the end to catch up, and usually the engine player can build his deck much quicker if he can buy multiple components on the way. Some of the things you can do when there's no presence of plus buys, you can look for gainers. Trash for benefit cards, like Remodel, for example, or Workshop, that can gain you extra cards even though you're not actually buying them. Sometimes, if you can slow your opponent down while you're buying just 1 province per turn, that can be enough, especially if the slowing down, maybe if you're playing a devastating attack every turn, or the 1 province per turn is so reliable that that can be enough to win the game. So when you're knowing your limitations, remember to consider the plan you had for attacks, and if there's enough trashing to pull off what you want to do. These are all things that you want to consider when you're building an engine, and these are all the factors that determine whether or not an engine is present on the board. So in this case, all of the components are here. There are attacks to slow your opponent down, village buy, there's trashing to take care of the attacks, and there are at least decent counters. There's also additional ways to score points. There's a Kingdom Victory card in Fairgrounds and also Monument for VP tokens. So this seems like all the components for an engine are here, and the engine could be strong enough to overcome getting attacked by opponents' witches and militias. So, that's all for this video. I encourage you to look at boards and try and find the engine there. being able to find an engine is a very good skill to have, because missing an engine can be the difference between you winning a game and getting slaughtered by the player who notices the engine and plays it against you very well. In the next video, we're going to continue along the line items for what to look for when you're assessing a kingdom. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.